To have Representative Ro Khanna here in conversation with Joe Stiglitz. We're going to have a relatively free-flowing discussion. Let me also say, before we forget, we'd like to thank Olena Jennings, Savannah Lucas, Gabriela Plump, Ola. I don't know, you have to tell us your last name at the end. Okay, thank you. Thanks very much for your help with the conference, and a little round of applause, I guess, for them. So it's been great. Without further ado, I'll just let you get started. Ro Khanna is a leading thinker within the Democratic Party on these issues of industrial policy. And so we're very honored to have you here, and look forward to your thoughts.
Okay, and so this is just going to be a free-flowing conversation, and maybe I should just begin with a few comments about the conference that we've had over the last 2 days. It's been on industrial policy, with a remarkable amount of attention to IRA, the CHIPS Act, but also industrial policies in Europe, in Brazil, in other places. Some of us have been involved in industrial policy for decades at the World Bank, and so there's a little bit attempt to see what are the lessons of the past are relevant to today. But I think what was striking about the papers that we've had is how strong the empirical evidence that these policies have actually worked. There are, the kinds of sophisticated econometrics that look at the effects on before and after the policies in counties places where they have them and where they don't. Very careful analysis, I think, has made a very persuasive case at the microeconomic level that a lot of these industrial policies have been really very effective. So that should make you feel good that the political support for these industrial policies now has, I think, a kind of empirical evidence that maybe it didn't have 5 or 10 years ago. It had evidence in time series and comparative country analysis. Countries that did it in East Asia did better, but it wasn't the kind of very strong statistical evidence that we have now. But as the closing session of this 2-day conference, we thought it'd be interesting to get a little bit of a political angle on it and understanding of how people in Washington see this. Maybe as we go through our discussion, if you have suggestions about what we ought to do to give you better evidence or give better guidance of how to design, or as I'll say at the end, about the next administration, hopefully, that is serious about doing industrial policy right, what a better for designing industrial policies, directing industrial policies. Ro is from Silicon Valley, and I always think of Silicon Valley as really one of the maybe unintended but success stories of industrial policy. It just didn't happen that this huge industry grew up in Silicon Valley. It was a result of maybe my own prejudice, but of Stanford, Berkeley, and then some companies coming out there to interact, and it really was a real success case of that. So you've lived in are living in perhaps the biggest success case of industrial policy. So I want to go back to the time the 2 important industrial policy bills were passed, the CHIPS Act and the IRA. What was the politics like? One of the things we had some discussion about was it took a long time to get the CHIPS Act passed, where our dependence on Taiwan was already very evident and been made even more evident by COVID-19. Why did it take so long? And then also the comments, a similar discussion of the IRA. What was the politics of getting that passed? Besides maybe some comments about Manchin. We've heard a little bit about him, but okay.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. A great honor to be here in conversation with Professor Stiglitz. I've borrowed his phrase of progressive capitalism and have been a great admirer of his work about how we make the economic system work for everyone. I was talking to a young person who had voted for Zohran Mamdani, and she said to me, the problem with capitalism is some of us don't have the capital. And it struck with me, but a lot of Professor Stiglitz's work has been tackling the challenges of economic inequality. When Trump won his election, I think that was a wake-up call to the governing class that places around America that had been hollowed out, that had faced deindustrialization, that had faced a lack of economic hope, did not feel part of modernity, that they were told to move, they were told to go get other jobs, and that this was not something that they wanted as communities, and in many ways they felt abandoned. And so when President Biden came into office, he had a clear sense that we had to speak to rural America, factory towns, communities where there was a decline of economic hope, that we had to speak to people who were not going to have college degrees, but also had generations of doing things and building things and making things, and that we needed to do so in a way that was thoughtful and smart, that we weren't going to be able to manufacture everything in the United States, but there were areas where we needed self-reliance, and that should coincide with bringing these jobs into communities that hadn't had them. And that was really the genesis for the CHIPS Act and the IRA. Now, why did it take so long? Well, for the longest time, there was a consensus, I think, since Reagan, that the government intervention in these areas was not economically smart, that we should let capital go where it should go. You had the Solyndra example under President Obama. People didn't talk about Tesla, but they talked about Solyndra's failure. And so there was a reluctance to be willing to have that kind of an investment in Congress. And it was really Trump breaking the mold, that saying that the free markets weren't working, that gave the opportunity to do things like targeted industrial policy. And then you had Ohio itself, the governor and others setting up the Ohio Fund, the Jobs Fund, where Ohio's government bought the land that Intel used for the chip plant. They basically subsidized it with Ohio tax dollars. And so you had both Republican governors and Democrats saying we needed to do something on industrial policy. Now, what were the challenges? The implementation was slow in some of these places. There was perhaps not enough thought into who would buy the product. So there was a large sense of how do we build the supply side, but not is Apple going to actually buy these chips, or who's going to buy these chips? Some of it was very high tech. So people wanted a steel plant, or they wanted a plant that they understood. They didn't necessarily think they were going to get the semiconductor plant. And the places that we had these things were not exactly small towns or rural communities. They were Columbus, next to Ohio State. So they were places that were already thriving within the state. So it didn't seem like it was affecting the smallest communities. I read in the paper just a few days ago that Logan, Ohio, today has a plant that's closing, the Tops paper plant. And Burlington, Iowa has a plant closing that makes construction. 200 jobs lost in each of those communities, hollowed out. One of the things that would be interesting for the economists here is to say, well, what can be done in a community like that when that happens? Are we Should there be massive effort to have a national economic development project there? Should there be intervention before a plant goes out to see if there's a market failure and have some intervention or not? But the problem still stays with us. And so while President Biden, I think, made progress on chips, there was not the sufficient focus that we had on small towns, rural communities, deindustrialization. The second thing is that, and then I'll talk about IRAs, that there was a concern about the immediate. People want a stimulus check. They want their grocery bills to come down. They want child care. And industrial policy takes time. It's, Silicon Valley took decades. And so in a political environment, the president also didn't get as much credit as probably he or the White House thought they would get for this industrial policy. That, yes, it was slower in implementation, but it also was not a clear political win. And there are a lot of cross currents when you're having that kind of a policy. Do the people want to give up their land? Are you creating competition for small businesses there? Are you creating competition for STEM, where other businesses now are going to have to pay more? So the politics within communities is not always easy. And then how do you get the permitting, and how do you get the approvals, and how do you get labor on board? So I think the politics of it turned out to be more complicated. On the Inflation Reduction Act, I was involved, and many people were with Senator Manchin. He basically was the key vote on that bill, and to his credit, he voted for a significant package. But again, I would go into Western Pennsylvania and say, we're going to build new steel plants, and people would clap, and I'd say, and there are going to be hydrogen and clean, and they'd stop clapping. So the climate is become such a polarized issue that thinking about how we can talk about industrial policy that is not just climate-based, I think, is important, though I share a lot of climate concerns. A final point before handing it back to you. I think we need broader than manufacturing as the approach to how do we revitalize these communities. Yes, we need manufacturing and industry, but we also have to look at the care economy, child care, elder care. We also need to look at universities and extension of universities and education. We also need to look at tech certifications, drone people who may do drones to measure roofs, or animators, or folks who are going to do surgical technicians or apply AI to small business. And I think that just the focus only on manufacturing did not come off as future-oriented enough in some of these communities.
Yeah, let me just agree very strongly. The fact is, as you know, manufacturing is less than 10%, 9% of GDP and of employment, and a 21st century economy is going to be a service sector economy, a R&D, knowledge-based economy, and there is actually a stronger argument for industrial policy in those sectors, including, by the way, construction, which is related to the living cost of housing. And the reason for that is in manufacturing, you have large enterprises, not all, but you have some, and therefore they can internalize, they can do R&D at scale. If you have small firms, which are the typical in the service sector and in construction, they can't do R&D. And in my mind, it really takes us back to the 19th century, where the major sector of the economy was agriculture, and the farm was too small to do R&D, and they didn't have the comparative advantage. And so the U.S. government and the Morrill Act set up in 1863, set up the Agricultural Extension Service for a public good of producing knowledge and then transmitting it to each farmer.
What would be the modern analog of that?
So the modern analog would be in construction, doing exactly the same thing, having construction centers in various places in the world, doing R&D, new designs of housing, materials, construction methods, and then disseminating it in an extension service. The same thing I would say is in a number of the service sector. Not banking, they have big enterprises, but in some of the smaller kinds of small enterprises, SMEs, and thinking about where there is more potential research that could, where the enterprises are too small to engage in the research, too many to really have a cooperative on their own, but the government can step in and actually provide that kind of R&D and extension services. So that seems to me really, and I would have felt more comfortable with some of these efforts. At least the rhetoric had moved away from manufacturing, which is very 19th century, early 20th, and towards where the structure of the 21st century economy is. One of the things that your remark about since Reagan, there's been a attitude against industrial policy. We have one very interesting paper which looked at the history of industrial policy and showed that actually it's been continuous since 1976. The data set only went back to basically that. And it went up and down. Carter was higher. It did go down a little bit under Reagan, but not a lot. And so there's been a disparity between the rhetoric and the reality. And I think that might be useful in when we get that distilled to send it over, because I think it really does show that we've always engaged, some of it through the Defense Department, but some of it Energy Department. It was a really interesting study that how pervasive it's been over the last 45, 50 years. I wanted to talk about both in the design of the policy and in the implementation, a couple questions. One of the things that was highlighted in the beginning of the IRA was there were going to be charging stations all over the country. And there were even notices that it was going forward, and then, except in a few places, it didn't happen. And we've had some discussion about it was Congress that was to blame, not the administration. Do you want to share your view about, are there lessons to be learned from that particular, I don't want to push too hard on that example, but one of the things is learn from the successes and learn from the failures, and that seems to be a failure.
It was. I mean, if you talk to Pete Buttigieg, he'll tell you it was how the bills were written. That apparently the goal was to get those electric charges by 2030 something, and it was not immediate, but that the communication of it was that, we were going to build these in an immediate way. There was also a lot of flexibility that was given to the states, and that may be something that needs to be looked at in terms of, is it the federal government that is going to determine at least the timeline and say, okay, you can determine where you want the chargers, but you've got to do it by this date on this implementation, not just a free-for-all in doing the states. And then a sense of the politics of this, that a president probably should not agree to a plan that calls for implementation in 2030 or 2032. I mean, the broadband, this was a problem. The ISP service providers delayed it to 2026. I mean, then they created all this checklist. That was not because the Biden administration wanted it. That was the internet service providers putting a lot of red tape into the bill to slow it down. And we accepted some of that on the Senate side, as a price of passing the bill. But then at the end of the day, those things weren't going to get done but till 2026, 2027. President's running for re-election, or Kamala Harris in 2024, and people say, well, where's the broadband? And so I do think I'm not enough of a student of American history other than knowing that in the New Deal or other things, it seems more immediate, that there was a sense that things were actually getting done. And it's one challenge on non-manufacturing industrial policy in that people want the visual and they want the visible, tangible. And so that may be not a manufacturing factory, maybe it's a trade school, maybe it's an extension, but there's got to be some vivid demonstration of something coming up in a community that makes people feel there's a difference, and it's got to be immediate. And I think those are the lessons, some of the lessons of the previous administration.
Yeah. So another aspect of implementation in any of these is that is sustainability. You pass a law and there's a good administration, but we're still in a democracy, and if you are in a democracy, it can change, and it did in that case. And there was a lot of discussion at the time that they had worked hard to make the IRA particularly Trump-proof. And it doesn't seem as if it's as Trump-proof as they thought. Do you want to comment?
Nothing in our country seems as Trump-proof as we thought. Other than if you offend the bond market, I guess that's the one thing you can't do. But I mean, many of those tax credits are still in place, but they're slated to expire in 2025, 2026. So I do think they spawned a large amount of investment, and I'm sure you've seen these charts. I mean, manufacturing investment really shot up under the Biden years. The investment that IRA and CHIPS had a major impact going higher, and I think it's had an impact. But the reality is that climate has become, unfortunately, so politicized. How we depoliticize it is a huge challenge. One is, of course, as the price of solar and wind and geothermal fall, it's an easier argument to make. And as our energy needs with AI data centers increase, it's an easier argument to make as people's electricity prices are going up, and we're the party saying we're for all of the above solutions. But I also think that we probably need to take an approach of not just labeling everyone who disagrees with us on climate as just anti-science, and though some are, but to say, look, people have different valuations of risk, of jobs, of what they think the immediacy of these goals are, of how much they are focused on their daily lives, and being able to connect these policies to their economic well-being is key. The president tried to do it; he just was not able to do it successfully at all times.
But did you expect that there would be this push to repeal the IRA provisions, the
Yes.
subsidies? What?
Yes. I mean, we didn't expect necessarily that we'd lose the House and the presidency. We thought we would have the House, even if we lost the presidency. But there's no doubt in my mind that if there was going to be a Republican trifecta, they would have gone after the IRA, because for them, the Affordable Care Act, because it's affiliated with Obama, and IRA are just two issues that they will repeal. They will fight to repeal them. This is why traditionally having bipartisan legislation is, of course, better, but it wasn't for a lack of effort. I mean, the president tried. He got it with chips and science. He got it with infrastructure. We were not able to get a single Republican vote on the IRA.
So in short, you don't think there was anything you could have done to make it more sustainable? That knowing that there might be a Republican president, making it so that it could survive a hostile presidency.
I mean, I think with a lot of the jobs were created in red states. The jobs, in fact, there was criticism that these jobs weren't going into union states or states with union jobs. I suppose you could have tried to draft things more broadly as production manufacturing credits and not the climate part. But in my view, there's just an irrationality to the opposition to the development of renewable energy on their side. I mean, even put aside the climate, why wouldn't you want this new market in the United States as opposed to in China or other parts of the world? But there is not. I can't. I mean, I'm open to ideas, but I can't think of another way we could have designed it that you wouldn't have had the opposition in a trifecta the way we've had.
Could you have designed it, for instance, to be more focused on the purple states so that if they went after those jobs, there was a higher probability that they would lose seats and stakes, and therefore, if they did that, there would be bigger political consequences?
I mean, we probably should have focused some of the projects more on Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin. I mean, a lot went to Georgia. I mean, you could make an argument that a lot of the benefits initially went down south to right-to-work states, that not enough came up to Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin. I do think maybe that could have been one thing, both in terms of the politics of it and in terms of the durability. Though, Georgia is a fairly big swing state, and there were a lot of projects there. And some of the solar projects have been protected up till at least 2026, and some of the production tax credits have been protected till 2026. But on energy, I mean, it's a sad state for the country because there just is such Republican opposition to anything dealing with climate.
Yeah. So I want to switch to another aspect. The IRA and the CHIPS Act have, for the most part, very different ways of putting out money. One was through a tax credit, one was through allocation of money, grants. Do you want to talk about the rationale for those differences? Was there a lot of discussion in each of those two bills about design, whether there should have been, having more allocation on one and more credit on the other? How did it fall out in the way that it did, and to what extent was that thoughtful, or was it just the politics?
I think in retrospect, people feel the CHIPS Act, or at least I know some of the companies feel the CHIPS Act should have been more weighted towards the tax credits than the grants, and because the grants took almost a year to get out, and it was a huge challenge logistically. And why, they wanted some grant up front to compete with what they were getting in Europe and what they were getting in other countries, and that's why there was the initial grant. But I think that the two lessons of the CHIPS Act were that we should have probably had more heavy tax credits and should have had some tax credits or some assessment on buying what those chips that were being produced. That there was not enough thought about who was going to buy these chips if they were made in the United States. On IRA, the tax credits we had positive input about the solar tax credit, the production tax credit. These were things that were dramatically increased, that were extended, and there really wasn't much thought about doing the grants, especially given the Solyndra example and some of the examples in the past. There was a clear sense that, well, if you did it in a tax credit way, you're basically neutral. You're not having the government sit there picking a particular company. And with semiconductors, you have more of a sense of who the players are: TSMC and Intel and Samsung. In a case of new energy companies, with startups, it's more logistically much more difficult. So I think the tax credit sense there made sense, and there was never really a debate about grants.
So one of the big disadvantages of the tax credit is that they're open-ended, and we don't know fully what the cost I mean, partly because they may be terminated, but if they had continued, there were estimates that came out that the IRA tax credits had been estimated at $350 billion, and then I think Goldman Sachs came out with $1 trillion and $1.5 trillion. I guess was there anxiety in the Congress about an open-ended subsidy like that? And do you have any feelings about, that? Yeah, I don't want to say blank check. I understand the strong argument having self-selection rather than the government selecting. That's I think a strong argument. But the other side is the open-endedness.
I'd have to look at it. Does it not expire after 10 years in the way we had written it? I would have to check, but I thought...
No, they were limited, but even in those 10 years,
Right.
the numbers that Goldman Sachs came out were, and Brookings also came out with a number, rather than the $350 billion, they were talking about between $1 and $1.5 trillion.
Over the 10-year, over the period. Look, I think that there was a sense that this was an investment worth making, that we needed to do it, that would generate growth, that it would generate more tax revenue. But I do think having some perhaps finite level of renewal after a certain amount of years on these tax credits to evaluate whether they're still needed, whether they're still generating the desired impact is valuable. But that was not a significant issue. Even for Manchin, I don't think that was a significant issue, the duration of it. The total price tag, I guess, was. And so, if there were ways to structure it, I know he wanted to keep it under $1 trillion, the total price tag. I think it was $700 or $800 billion in the way the CBO scored it. So that was, to that extent, it mattered.
Yeah, I mean, that's the scoring, but the question a little bit is there any way of thinking if you do that, whether you can, for instance, you could have a provision that said the length of time is related to the take-up, and so if there's too much take-up, we don't want to spend more, the CBO does the best job in scoring, but they make mistakes both sides. And so you can say, we think it's worth spending $1 trillion, but not $2 trillion. If you were going back to pass the law next time, is that something that Congress might think about?
In terms of saying we want this spending until solar has some penetration or some metric?
Something like that, and we don't want to spend more than X amount, and if it starts going over that, the time duration of the benefit will be curtailed, and we'll have to go back to Congress to reauthorize it.
Yeah, my sense is that we may have to get the 60 senators or the 51 senators to do that. I mean, I think there'll be a group of people who say, let's try to get as much as we can in terms of pushing for a repeal of fossil fuel subsidies and investments in solar and wind and geothermal and incentivize it. But as a practical matter, to get senators who are concerned about the fiscal impact, saying, look, we can have benchmarks on when these subsidies expire. And maybe that would have prevented the push to have them all run out in 2026 if they were going to expire anyway by 2028. I do think it's worth considering in the drafting of the bill.
Yeah. Are there any other lessons as you look back at CHIPS and IRA at this point that if you could have redone it, I mean, putting the politics aside, and maybe after that with the politics, that you would have argued that you ought to have a slightly different bill?
Well, I would have focused more on some of the hardest hit areas of Western Pennsylvania, Ohio, downriver Michigan, and see what type of economic activity could come up there. Because while the macro industrial policy made sense in terms of our self-reliance from dependence on Taiwan, or the macro policy of having America produce solar and wind and geothermal and battery plants. It's not as clear that it tied to the economic renewal of places that had lost economic hope. So I guess I would be more focused on an economic development strategy in these communities that was manufacturing based in part, but also broader than manufacturing. You know, putting a trade school in every community, putting an extension in regions, making some sense of the types of manufacturing loans that, or small business loans that a community may need that wouldn't get a semiconductor plant. I think that the policy was driven with good intentions from an American competitiveness standpoint and less from a micro community standpoint.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Are there other aspects of infrastructure that could have been directed? I mean, the infrastructure bill was also very macro, is my impression. Would you have tried to think about how you could get the infrastructure bill more micro and targeted and place-based?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could have looked at that, though the infrastructure bill worked to a fair extent. I mean, you saw construction, you saw a lot of activity, but I think getting it more place-based, and then to partly the challenge for the president, while he couldn't travel as much out into these communities, he was very focused at some point on the war in Ukraine, and he lost the domestic economic messaging. I once joked to John Podesta, and I have respect for both of these people, but I said, you worked for a president, Bill Clinton, who hollowed out all of Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, and it was at 60% approval. Now you're working for a president who's bringing it all back, and he's stuck at 40%. Have you wondered why? And because Clinton was so good, and I'm not, at going and having these roundtables of economic empowerment in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and he'd have everyone there talk about what the economic vision was, and everyone believed that was his central issue, to figure that out. And so some of this was a communications challenge, that we just thought that the legislation in its grandiose ways was going to translate to the political argument. And I think it doesn't. And we need to be very, very energetic about communicating what we're doing in these communities.
Yeah, I mean, I went down with Clinton down to, we had a meeting in Columbus, one of these big regional, and we had them in every region about how do we create jobs and not just reindustrialize, but reinvigorate each of the regions of the country. One of the this is a very international group, and one of the other issues that we haven't talked about this year, but we did talk about last year, was some of what we did in those two bills violated WTO, probably. Since there's no WTO appeal court, we can't really be sure, but as a little bit of a trade lawyer, I think it probably did violate. Was there any concern two questions. Was there any concern in Congress when they were discussing this, whether we were violating the WTO agreement that we had signed? And I guess the other question is, do you think how do we deal with that international consequence of our industrial policy having effects on other countries?
Well, as you know, there's a national security exemption to some of the WTO rules, and so that was, I think, what was partly invoked on the CHIPS Act. And none of the European countries sued. China sued us, which is still being resolved, but none of the European countries actually sued the U.S. when it came to CHIPS or IRA. There was diplomacy, and there was and people were upset about it, but they didn't actually take it to the World Trade Organization. I think there was a sense that, look, there's in a modern world where China and other countries are massively subsidizing industry, that the United States can't be hamstrung by rules where we aren't allowed to do the same for critical industries. And while in the crafting, they looked with the lawyers at making sure we fit in some exceptions, there wasn't that much concern about it because there's a genuine view that those trade deals as written needed to be revised.
So does that mean, I mean, since we're in a world where revising those trade agreements is going to be very difficult and at best take years and years, does that mean basically we're in a law of the jungle where any country, we have no rules about state aid, to use the European word, that any country can decide it can subsidize its industry to try to, to use it steal jobs from other countries?
I do think a lot of it is going to be bilateral trade negotiation and the types of trade negotiation that we're seeing now. I mean, I don't agree with the blanket approach to tariffs, but I think that there's a sense in many countries of similar problems to the United States, the economic concentration of wealth in certain areas, deindustrialization, economic inequality, a recognition that nation needs to have some level of self-reliance. This doesn't mean autarky or just an aversion to trade, but a sense that globalization didn't work out in a way that was balanced enough for hollowed out communities. And so my sense is that, and this is going to be a very difficult balance for the next Democratic administration, is how do we not have a tariff-oriented blanket policy and yet still recognize that when it comes to state aid and when it comes to some kind of industrial policy, that's worthwhile. Now, also, state aid is less regressive, in my view, than a tariff, which is hitting the working class and consumer class. The state aid you could raise from the wealthier in terms of tax policy. But when Trump said tariffs, Chris Deluzio was a member of Congress from Western Pennsylvania, said Kamala Harris was running these ads in Western Pennsylvania saying Goldman Sachs says Trump's tariff policy is going to cost the average family $3,000 more. And he had to go and tell her, you're hurting me every day. Take that ad down. Because for a lot of people, tariffs meant jobs. And they didn't trust the economic elite, which they thought had resulted in the outsourcing of those jobs. So now I think the pendulum is shifting, where they're saying, well, these tariffs have, led to higher grocery prices and there are higher input costs for manufacturing and the factories aren't really coming back. But I think that the balance of our engagement with the world economically is one that we're still trying to figure out.
Yeah. So, I mean, one aspect of that is obviously we have resources, much more resources than developing countries. In fact, I hear from the senior officials in Europe that they complain that they can't compete with the United States, that they didn't have the resources to compete with the IRA. But developing countries clearly don't. Do you have any sense? I mean, should we? How should we? Assuming a next Democratic administration that cares about social justice on a global level, how do we deal with this problem that we want to advance industrial policy for a whole variety of reasons? You mentioned resilience, national sovereignty, and growth and green transition, but it gives us a comparative advantage, artificial, you might say, because of our wealth over developing countries, and that generates resentment, and and in terms of our broader setting in the global community. Do you have any view about how we should handle that?
I think the best thing that the United States could do for the world is to be a functioning, cohesive, multiracial democracy. And I think that the neglect of communities in America that at a time of more cultural diversity was a big mistake in the project of becoming a multiracial democracy, and has led to a isolationism and a cut to U.S. aid and a moral callousness in some of our foreign policy, whether it was in Venezuela or Gaza, that has had much worse repercussions in the world. So what I would say is that our highest priority should be the economic independence and success of people in our community to see that the future is possible, but that it should be then supplemented by an engagement with the rest of the world, where we're helping through aid and economic development, where we can't make everything here. I mean, there are probably certain consumer goods and things that we can still import, and that we are actively encouraging the economic development of other nations in the way China tries to do in Africa and the South, but without with it being clear that the economic success of our community communities are the highest priority. And in this, I think a healthy patriotism ultimately is necessary for a more just cosmopolitanism. And I think if there was a mistake of the 90s, and I'm not saying if I were in Congress or in charge at the time, I wouldn't have made the same mistake. It was perhaps that we were rushing towards a just global society without recognizing that the massive inequalities and resentments within would make that project much harder.
I couldn't agree with more with everything you've said, but it actually leads me to ask the question, which is not really on industrial policy, but what are some of the things on the first part of the agenda of really successfully creating a strong multiracial, multi-ethnic society in America?
Well, I do think that the looking at the jobs and the economy in these communities that have been hollowed out are so important. So I tell this story about, which I've shared with President Obama directly. I said, when he was running for the Senate in Illinois, he went down to Galesburg, Illinois. The Maytag factory was closed. Jobs were going to Mexico. And people remember he went there without a press release. He sat down, he had beer, he had pizza, and no press. And he left and he listened and he cared about it. And he spoke about it in his 2004 convention speech. And 20 years later, they still remember that. And I said, but the bad news is that Galesburg is worse than when you were president. And so, the challenge is, and it's not an easy challenge, what are we going to do to reverse the economic possibility in these communities? I don't think it's just industrialization. And with AI, it's even more challenging in what's going to happen. But some combination of construction and care jobs and healthcare jobs and education jobs in diverse ways in these communities, I think is critical. And by showing that we care, by simply saying, we understand that the American dream was possible, you now don't think it's possible, and I'm going to bring it back. That's basically Trump's message. And there's a great book about in Western Pennsylvania how doctors voted for him and engineers voted for him. It wasn't just working class folks, and it's not just that they wanted a higher minimum wage. It's that they felt that their whole communities had been lost the sense of economic pride and economic possibility. And Trump said, I'm going to bring you back. Of course, my view is 19th century tariffs and land wars isn't going to do it. But we have to convince them that we have a real roadmap to how we're going to build it back. And that economic concern of their being able to have the American dream, I think, is a cultural concern. It's saying that we understand that sense of loss and anger and pain, and we care about it, and we're not neglecting it. And so that economic foundation, I think, is the prerequisite for building a multiracial democracy.
Yeah. So, I guess it goes back to saying we really need place-based industrial policies as well as sectoral-based industrial policies. And that was really something that was not included as strongly as it could have been in the CHIPS Act and in IRA.
Yes, I think we definitely need place-based industrial policies. We need place-based policies. I don't know if by industrial does industrial policy incorporate service sector?
Yeah,
Yes.
the word industrial policy is
Yes.
in academia
Yeah.
has it's a really bad word, but we haven't been able to figure out a better word.
Right.
And all we mean is intervention in the market allocation of resources in production, and so it's a peculiar word.
Yeah.
Like very.
I think place-based makes a huge difference, and then I think some intervention that's felt more broadly about the vast economic divide, where people feel that the $5 trillion companies in my district, and they have the American dream, and others don't. I mean, I think those two sentiments. I mean, whatever we can do to make the American dream, which I believed in growing up, feel more possible. Now, I hear all these economists, and you may know more, saying that materially we're better off and things have improved. But when you talk to people, they don't feel that way. They feel that the American dream, based on having a job that can support a family and support healthcare and education and childcare, was much more accessible back in the 60s and 70s. And Trump has kind of combined that with a racial nostalgia. And so we've got to sort of show how that economic future is going to be better.
I mean, that's just one example where I think the GDP statistics don't really reflect what people experience. One aspect of that, the minimum wage today is lower than it was 60 years ago, adjusted for inflation. Right. So that's, people at the bottom really are absolutely worse off, and even the median has really stagnated, and I think partly it's that the disparity between people in the middle and people at the top, which they see every day now, not only it used to be in TV, but now in social media, it sort of exacerbates this kind of feeling that they've lost the American dream.
And I think that inequality is really putting stress on our politics. And then the place-based, I think, is important because, if you look at J.D. Vance's sort of view of the hierarchy of Americans, right? The sense that if your great-great-great-grandparents fought in the Civil War or World War II, that you have more of a stake in having built America. A large part of our cultural challenge is, well, where are we going to accept tradition and honor the sacrifices of people who contributed, while not diminishing an immigrant or a son or daughter of immigrants who, in the Lincoln sense, believes that the allegiance to America is based on the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, and that's what's defining. And so going to places where there are generations of people who feel they built the coal, they built the steel, and that the country is not recognizing their sacrifice and is not valuing them. They should not be put up on a pedestal of having a higher American citizenship, but they also should not be dismissed as not being cared about. And I think it's the economic place-based policy is also saying culturally, we get it, you matter, we appreciate you, which I think is important to build a multiracial democracy.
Yeah, I guess another aspect of, we talk about production, but the other part is community-based. Yeah. The schools, the part of, I think that one of the things that's been you see is the hollowing out of the cities, and the small businesses who used to be some of the people who were important in creating a community. I come from Gary, Indiana. I go back there, and it's devastating. Yeah. These places are really hollowed out, not just in the sense of jobs. Gary, a city now, used to be 200,000, is 100,000. There's not a single grocery store in the city. It's a food desert, and people buy food, junk food in the drugstores or.
But let me ask you: do you think it's a political problem or a substantive problem. In other words, let's say someone had an FDR-like mandate. Could they, in 4 and 8 years, turn around Gary, Indiana, or would it be hard?
Oh, it would be hard. Let me say that, but there's no doubt about that. And history matters. 50 years ago, if they had come in, I think they could have turned it around. You see places where government intervention saw that there was a decline, came in and say, how do we shift and create a new community? Pittsburgh was a steel town, very much like Gary, Indiana. But Pittsburgh had an advantage of having two good institutions, Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh. And those two institutions became the focal point of a revival of what, when I went to Pittsburgh, we had relatives there, and you didn't really realize you were in beautiful mountains because you couldn't see anything. And the benefits of deindustrialization is now you can see the hills and the green. But it was the universities that really played the central role in industrial policy. So they were lucky. If the government had come in 50 years ago into Gary, I think they could have found some other, could have shifted the production to keep jobs there and keep the community alive. It would have diminished a little bit, but it would have been.
Do you think the next Democratic administration should make place-based renewal a top priority, and is it, how achievable is it?
I think it should make it a priority. I mean, I think that, partly for politics, because I think where we are, the divisiveness in the country, and you see those maps, is very clearly related to that kind of sense of lack of opportunity in large parts of the country. But I would even say there's an economic argument that there's social capital in communities that dissipates if you don't use it. And that's why I say history matters, and 50 years of neglect, you can't undo that right away. But I think you can create communities, and I think they ought to begin by, I think it ought to be a priority. There has to be an economic basis of a community. You can't have, yeah. And that's where some of the things that you say, it's going to be more of a service sector, and that means more of a care community. And one aspect of the care community is we underpay care workers. And I say we disrespect care workers. And people who care for other people are really performing an important function.
No, absolutely. Someone had asked me what I think of Elon Musk becoming a trillionaire. I said, well, if there's a 5% wealth tax, we could pay for universal child care, $10 a day, and and $20 an hour for child care workers. The challenge is there's a gendered component to it as well. And we want to have care work, we want to have elder care. The challenge is just, what if you've had a father, a grandfather who's built stuff, and you've gone into a steel factory and you want to make things, what do we say? And you don't want to do care work. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with care work. It's, of course, probably the most important work. But what do you say to those folks?
Well, I mean, we still have construction needs. We still, nice communities. I mean, like New York, have parks. You need to take care of the parks. That's, So I guess what I would say is that there are lots of other jobs as well, but we are moving into that kind of a care economy. The gender aspect, though, is another. we should recognize that some of the reasons that the wages are low in the care economy is gender discrimination, which has been part of our society forever. And so if we got rid of that gender discrimination, the wages would be significantly higher.
I completely agree. But this, I think, is to the older people here. You asked what are the areas of research or places of study. My sense is whoever comes as a Democrat, and after Tuesday, I'm more hopeful that not a foregone conclusion that a Democrat's going to win, but at least a possibility in 26 and 28. I don't think they're going to wholly reject the Biden approach, which is to say we've got to have place-based policy, but they're probably going to say, how do we make that place-based policy better? How do we, and what does it look like to turn around different communities? What are the care-based jobs? What are the technology-based jobs? What are the construction-based jobs? How do we do this? And how do we do it in measurable time frames, in 6 months, in a year? What are things that we can show that are working, even if it takes a long time to put up a factory? I think all of that research would be consequential in actually mattering. Not that, a lot of academic research, you don't do it just for what's going to matter for policy. But in this case, if people had that interest, I think it could actually have an impact, because I don't think there's been enough thought about it. That even if you had, that's why I was thinking, even if you had the political mandates, how would you actually do it?
Yeah, so that brings back a little bit. We were talking about extension services, creating research centers. Different, construction is going on all over the country. You have some research centers, and we talk about right now affordability of housing, a shortage of housing, and so you have. I know this is a radical, but social housing, government.
From Vienna, the Vienna sort of.
The Vienna, exactly. I was going to, and it's worked there. And you ask the question, why can't we have housing that actually works? And
that would create jobs of building it and installing it. What do you make of the argument for where the private sector is? In other words, I was struck when I met President Sheinbaum was there with Don Bacon, and Sheinbaum is arguably to the left of almost anyone in the American political sphere. But the first thing she asked me was, well, can you get some of the tech companies in your district to invest in Mexico? And it struck me that if you're not from a wealthy country, even the political left has an interest in attracting capital, that you can't take economic development for granted. And in some ways, we have in this country, to your point, places that have been neglected, taken the economic development for granted. We just thought we didn't need to do it because we were wealthy. How much do you think the private sector, if at all, should have a role in the capital allocation in the development, or do you think it's really for the government with social housing and other areas?
So I think I would redesign our financial system. Is where I've been arguing that for a long while. But part of where our financial system went wrong was creating these big New York national banks, but also Charlotte, North Carolina. And the point of that was that it took capital away from the rest of the country. And there's actually a lot of evidence, both in developing and in the U.S. on this, that banks' important role is to lend to small and medium-sized enterprises, but they can only do that when they're locally based. They can only do that well, because there are information asymmetries. What? Yeah. There are information asymmetries, and so obviously, somebody sitting in New York is not going to be able to make a good judgment about who's a good businessman in Columbus, Ohio. But if you had a Columbus bank, they would be. That was a bad example but if you had a Columbus bank, they would be able to make those judgments. So
regional feds do that, or are they not really?
The regional feds are not. Also, but with the regional FEGs or the national, should have put more emphasis on the survival of community banks and local banks, and in 2008, we closed hundreds of these community banks. And in the S&L crisis, we closed hundreds of those. So the picture of the American banking system today is very different from what it was. And I think that it has been one of the impediments to the ability of the private sector to do its role, because it's not going to be big enterprises coming in. It's going to be small and medium-sized enterprises. And you have to have a financial system that is directed to local small and medium-sized enterprises. So one of the things I would do is, actually two things, try to reinvigorate the community banks, small and medium-sized. Some of them can be...
Was the CDFI not an effort in that direction?
It was an effort in that. Yeah, exactly. And so reinvigorate that.
Right.
So these are not new ideas. Some of these are... Okay, yeah. Some of these are old ideas.
No, old could be good.
One state has a state development bank, and it's like a World Bank, but at a state level, and those kinds of institutions can play an important role, because they have a longer, it's more patient capital, they're longer term, they're thinking about how can we had a talk about the high road versus the low road for development, EV battery creation. And so the State Development Bank could push the high road of development, high wages, high technology, focusing on spillovers.
And if you were to prioritize between two choices, an administration that said, we've got to compete with China on semiconductors, EVs, batteries, and the technologies of the future, or we've got to compete on, or we've got to focus on regional place-based economic renewal. I get that maybe the best case is that there's a convergence, but let's say there's not. What would you prioritize?
I'm a two-handed economist, so I say do both. And I don't see any reason why you can't do both. You're too much of an economist, so you're trying to focus me in making the trade-offs between the two. And I guess I would say that I would echo what you said before. If we don't solve the ability of our country to act together, we won't win. There's no way that we can, if we are as dysfunctional as we are right now, I view the game as over. So for me, restoring some sense of national unity, and if we did that, we had the best universities, the strongest research establishment. We had good entrepreneurship. We had good VCs. So we had the structure, but we didn't have a society that functioned together. So if I were a doctor and diagnosing what was the major problem, I would come out with the same diagnosis that if we can solve that problem, the other part will come together.
Yeah, no, I agree very much with you. One of the things that has disappointed me, or I've been surprised by, in fact, I was speaking at my alma mater where I got my undergrad degree at University of Chicago, and the university president said, well, what's your advice about how the universities can be better? And I sort of said, well, I always viewed universities as sort of the crown jewel of American society. I'm not saying that they can't be better. I'm sure they cost a lot of money, and there's, there should be extraordinary room for argument and debate. But it seems to me that the silence of the defense of the university in American culture has been surprising to me, that more people haven't gotten up and said, not just, okay, we want universities because they are going to produce the next AI or Moderna, but that we want universities because they produce economists that make our policies more thoughtful, and that they produce liberal thinkers and constitutional thinkers, and that they're ingredients for a mature democracy. But we haven't heard much of a defense of universities.
Yeah, no, I've been disappointed too. You may see that we're wearing a pin here. Keep your hands off our students. So we're part of the resistance.
Yes.
But I mean, I feel a self-interest in agreeing with you very strongly that our universities are our critical institutions, and to me, at the forefront of creating an integrated society, and our institutions where discrimination is probably the lowest of any of our institutions to be attacked, because as if we're discriminating, I just find.
I mean, it seems to me that part of the challenge with the anger at the elites has been that two things. One, the country has dramatically changed. I mean, we've got an Indian American of Hindu faith representing Silicon Valley, and you had Barack Obama as president, and women. I mean, there's just a cultural change that it was never going to be a linear line to multiracial democracy. It's a very hard project to do. And then you had a real anger that we got into the war in Iraq. We got into these overseas wars. These communities were abandoned. And for all of these Ivy League educated economists and lawyers who were our governing class, they missed this. They didn't really deliver for us. And so the Trump phenomena is, well, just tear down these institutions because these institutions have betrayed you. And I think for the university to say, well, what we get with that is blanket tariff policies where they're tariffing coffee and they're talking about, which we don't produce here, and it's not really helping the community. But what is the role of knowledge, not as determinative, but as informative of democratic decision making? I just think that has to be thought, because it's undeniable that elite governance had mistakes, but it's also the answer can't be governed by ignorance. I mean, there has to be some balance.
Yeah. So we have just a few more minutes. Do you want to make a few? We just had an election that made some of us feel optimistic, but we've seen over the last 9 months violations of the rule of law that many of us thought were just inconceivable. We have troops in the streets that we think of as inconceivable. Do you want to give us a word of optimism or just some conclusion?
Well, we're not arrested for having this conversation. That's, I was in China with Adam Smith. We first China Codell that went there in 6 years. I'm on the China Select Committee, and we had a meeting with Bob Iger 2-3 years ago as the CEO of Disney, and he said, "How many of you have been to China?" And there wasn't a single hand that went up on this China Select Committee of 15 members of Congress. He said, "I've been there 40 times. Why should I listen to you?" So I said to the Republican chair at the time, I said, maybe we should just go to check the box. And it took 3 years to go there. Anyway, we were there, and a lot to discuss. But one of the questions I asked the Shanghai mayor was, or the party leader, who's more important than the mayor, is, well, people consider you as one of the successors to Xi Jinping in a flattering way. Is that true? And you could have heard like pin drop silence. No. So we have, democracy is in our blood. It is in our DNA. We are a loud, confident society where someone who's the security guard to this building thinks they have as much of a right and an opinion as a Nobel laureate or as a congressman to have a say. And I think Donald Trump is finding that as hard as he's trying to denigrate that, there is a huge reaction against it. I go to rural Nebraska and I talk about how farmers are getting shafted, and they want to talk about the ICE raids. They want to talk about the fact that young kids are being deported without due process. They don't want to just talk about the price of soybeans. And what you saw on Tuesday, I don't think people have bought into the Democratic vision, but they have said we certainly don't like what's going on with Donald Trump. And you had young men coming back to us. You had Latinos coming back to us, South Asians in New Jersey coming back to us, working class folks. I mean, it was a huge, huge win. I believe it's even stiffened the spine of some of the Supreme Court justices now who are asking maybe on these questions on tariffs that they're going to strike down what Trump has done. But, you know, he's a 42% president. He's not a 60% president. I was most concerned in the inauguration when Donald Trump was talking about going to Mars. And, you know, I know everyone thought, oh, he has these tech leaders behind him. He's got oligarchy. But Trump was invoking Kennedy-esque themes that we're going to build America. We're going to build a golden age. He was at 50% approval. And then he's gone and he's done things that I think, you know, 60% of the country disagrees with. So my hope and belief is that if we continue to be active, if we continue to mobilize, we're going to have a very good chance of prevailing in 26 and 28. I think the harder question is, can we build an enduring governing majority? Or are we just going to get in and then lose the Congress in 2030 because people are upset? You know, I said to President Biden when he was campaigning, I said, you know, the biggest mistake with Bidenomics is that FDR in his fourth term was still saying the country sucks and it's all Herbert Hoover's fault. You know, you can't proclaim victory in this year. So we are in an anti-incumbent time. We're in a time where people are upset. They fundamentally feel the American dream is declining. And I think, yes, we've got to win, but to paraphrase Churchill, we have to deserve victory. We have to figure out how are we going to build a coalition that is actually going to make a difference in people's lives and convince people of that. And that is a generational challenge, which hopefully all of us will contribute to.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for coming.
I really enjoyed it.